Welcome to everyone. It is time to start the next session. On behalf of the Joint Policy Board for Mathematics, it's a pleasure to introduce to you the 2024 winner of the JPBM Communications Award. Natalie Dean is an assistant professor in the Department of Biostatistics and Bioinformatics at Emory's Rollins School of Public Health. She received her PhD in biostatistics from Harvard University. She previously worked as a World Health Organization consultant and as faculty at the University of Florida. Her primary research area is in methods for infectious disease epidemiology and vaccine study design, and she co-directs the Emory Alliance for Vaccine Epidemiology and the Summer Institute in Statistics and Modeling of Infectious Diseases. She became active in communications at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic via Twitter and engaging with the press. She authored op-eds in the New York Times, Washington Post, Stat News, and Slate. She appeared on TV and radio, including CNN, MSNBC, Good Morning America, and NPR's All Things Considered. She has over 300 press quotes across national and international outlets. She was previously honored as a member of the Committee of Presidents of Statistical Society's Leadership Academy. She'll speak to us today on Tales from the Front Lines of Pandemic Communications. Professor Dean.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so I want to start just expressing my gratitude to the Joint Policy Board for Mathematics, to the American Statistical Association, my home association, and also to you for joining me on the last day of this meeting and listening patiently. Great, so in reflecting back on what I wanted to talk about today, sort of digesting what was a very strange time, I think, for all of us, but also a strange time for me as an infectious disease statistician and someone who sort of jumped headfirst into this public communications. So I was thinking back about sort of a set of anecdotes, a set of experiences, so you'll indulge me a little bit with that, reflecting back. But then also some of the things that I learned during this experience. And I did learn a lot. It really was a very different experience than anything that sort of we are taught in academia. And so I'll go through a little bit of background, a little bit of what my role was as a statistician, engaging with the media, engaging with the press, a few highs and lows, and then some lessons learned, and then some thoughts about what we as a community can do to improve our communications moving forward. Okay, so a little background. So thank you to Patty for the warm introduction. So my background is in biostatistics, but I've always been very motivated by infectious disease research. And actually during my PhD, I was focused on HIV/AIDS, and then worked with the World Health Organization's HIV department on setting their surveillance strategy, their survey design strategy for monitoring HIV drug resistance. Afterwards, I started as a postdoc at University of Florida, and I worked on the single most exciting project that I've ever been a part of, and I don't know how I'll be able to top this, but I was part of the team that designed and analyzed a phase 3 vaccine trial for an Ebola vaccine in Guinea using an innovative strategy, clinical trial design strategy known as ring vaccination. And ultimately it was successful and demonstrated both the efficacy of that particular vaccine, which is now licensed, but also the ability of innovation in trial design to work in a public health emergency in a difficult setting. And we learned an extraordinary amount that we can apply in future settings. During the Zika epidemic, I was very involved with modeling. So this is a figure from a paper in PNAS with a wonderful group at Northeastern, modeling the spread of Zika throughout the Americas and also looking at risk of Zika within the continental US. So that was, also sort of another experience responding to a new and emerging threat and having to work quickly to answer timely questions. And then as sort of a larger initiative, so after the West African Ebola epidemic, the research community realized there's more that we can do in advance of epidemics to be prepared to evaluate new vaccines and therapeutics. And so that led to the World Health Organization creating this R&D blueprint initiative for action to prevent epidemics. It was thinking about how we design clinical trials in a public health emergency for a set of target pathogens, priority pathogens, so pathogens for which we lack adequate medical countermeasures. And those included, in addition to Ebola and Marburg and some things that you may or may not have heard of, it included the severe coronaviruses, MERS and SARS-1, and also disease X, so some yet as identified pathogen that could pose a public health threat. And indeed, what we saw, we all know, we were all there. So there was the emergence of a novel coronavirus. So you may recall it was called nCoV 2019. So I was part of a fairly small community sort of infectious disease researchers, specifically infectious disease researchers for emerging pathogens that was sort of activated at that time. And there were a lot of meetings, although I was in a different situation in that I was also on maternity leave at the time with my second child, who was born December 2019. I think about her as being born around the same time as when the virus was circulating in China. But I was part of, brought in to sort of work on papers and come into meetings with WHO meetings. So what are we going to be doing? And I just want to share one anecdote, which is that I have this distinct memory of in February going to the grocery store and stocking up on a lot of stuff. And then the checkout, the cashier said, "Wow, you sure do have a lot of things." And I said, "I'm an infectious disease researcher and stuff is happening." And he looked at me like I was insane. And and then as we know, pretty soon after, the world shut down. So I started my sort of communication. It's not something I ever really planned to do, but I have this memory. So I started posting on Facebook, honestly, just to my friends and family. And I said, this is a post about, you may hear what's coming out of Italy. It's incredibly serious. In my expert opinion, we have passed the point where I will say, I don't want to alarm you. I would like to alarm you. Please take this very seriously. And actually, I had one of my best friend's mom said that I was the reason she went and got all her medications stocked up and everything. So I started out just interacting with my own community, my own friends and family. But then I shifted to Twitter. And so I have a set of colleagues who were all on Twitter at that time and realized that there was a lot of interest in understanding what was going on. And so Twitter was a place to both share information among colleagues. There was a lot of information sharing, like the first genetic sequence, right? Like there were things that were being shared, original line lists, things like that. And I, through a process, so someone sent me basically like a Google sheet. I was able to put in my credentials as someone who had previously worked on infectious disease research and was able to get verified. It's gone now, sorry, RIP to the blue check. There have been changes at Twitter since then. But I started tweeting. I started sharing kind of my interpretations of what was going on, some basic explanations of what was going on, how do we think about what is happening, and people were really interested, right? Like people really wanted to know and understand. So Twitter was a really important medium for me to share with my colleagues, and I'll talk about more sort of what that looked like. But it also led to other things. So for example, there were a lot of questions about infectious disease models and how we interpret models. And so you may remember this figure from the IHME, right? Okay, so we see, projections about COVID cases, or this is deaths per day. And look at that curve coming right on down, right? And a lot of us in the infectious disease community were saying, why is it going, what's causing it to go down? Like what is the underlying mechanism? And so I ended up spending a lot of time talking to reporters, particularly one Washington Post reporter, William Wan, and we spent a lot of time talking about what are the underlying mechanics of this model. And through digging through, the supplementary materials, whatever I could find, right, you realize that the inflection point occurred because there was an assumption built in that once there were enough cases, that things would look like they did in China. They would come back down the same way that they did in China. Just as they went up, they would flip around and go back. And so that led to a quote, right? So this is just one example of a quote. It's a valuable tool providing updated state-by-state projections. I did think it was one of the only tools that had sort of state-level dashboards, but it is inherently optimistic because it assumes that all states respond as swiftly as China. Okay, so this is one of my first, I think, press quotes, my first experiences talking to the press and providing sort of reflections on what is going on in this model, so using my background, my experience with modeling. And then when I realized things got really big time, it's when I have this very distinct memory. So I had a 2-month-old at the time, and we were walking around the block, and I would take press calls while I was pushing a stroller. And I have this memory of talking again to William Wan at the Washington Post. And he was like, well, when is everything going to go back to normal? When is it all, And this was like March of 2020. And I said, it's like asking a fireman when you could move back in, but your house is still on fire. And I was really proud of that quote. And I knew it was big time when Jake Tapper said it on CNN. So I was like, okay, wow, we are, I'm not in Kansas anymore. Like this is some big time stuff. So forgive me, I am going to tell a few more anecdotes. Okay, so another thing I did was I went weekly on BBC Radio World Service, which is, they had this sort of Ask the Expert forum, and people would call in and ask questions like, can COVID spread through urine, and like, should I, share my meals with my family, and all these things, and it would be people from all over the world asking. It was a very strange experience for me. I was fortunate to be one of several members on the panel because some of the questions were much more clinical than I, as a infectious disease, statistician, could answer. I knew about viral dynamics. I knew about these sort of, trends and things and how to interpret the data, but didn't know some of these clinical questions. But I have a very distinct memory. We were all at home, so I was taking all these calls from home. And I have a very distinct memory of someone knocking on the door. And it was the mailman. I could look out and I could see it was the mailman. And he kept knocking. And so I had to scribble on a piece of paper, I'm on live radio, off soon. So this is me, just indulge me. I'm just reflecting back. Okay, so another thing was going on TV, and I really only did this sort of early on because I realized it wasn't for me. It's very challenging. You're looking at a blank screen, actually, most of the time when you're talking. You don't actually see who you're looking at. You're looking at just black, and you don't really know what questions they're going to ask. You talk to a producer beforehand, but you don't really know. In one of these, was set up to debate someone about herd immunity, and I was like, I did some things that I'm proud of myself for having done. I can say that I did it, but it wasn't my favorite experience. But that's a different medium, right? It's asking very high-level questions. They're looking for pithy answers. It's a very different, one thing I learned is there's many different types of communication, many different types of audiences. TV, cable news being one particular one that is probably the furthest departure from academia. Okay, where I felt much more comfortable was in writing op-eds. I like to write, I like to explain, I like teaching. I mean, I think many of us really enjoy teaching. And so Twitter was nice in that I wrote a thread about, how do we, back in the days when there were a lot of discussion about how we evaluate new therapeutics, like hydroxychloroquine. Should we run a trial even though there's this small observational study from France, from this kind of unusual man, demonstrating that hydroxychloroquine was effective at reducing deaths or severe disease. And, but sort of reiterating the fundamentals of the importance of clinical trials, the importance of randomized controlled research, and importance of not cutting corners. And so I wrote a thread, and it sort of drew from previous experience of having these conversations through the R&D blueprint with WHO. And I was invited to write, so I was reached out to by a Washington Post editor, and together we prepared this thing, how to conduct coronavirus research at pandemic speed. I'm really proud of this one. This is like, I really was able to explain things and draw directly upon examples that came from a paper that we had recently published around the same time, actually, although the time scales, we submitted that New England Journal paper like a good year before, whereas the Washington Post one took about a week from start to finish. But they both came out about the same time. But it drew directly from examples in my own research, which is thinking about the importance of randomized trials during disease outbreaks. There were other op-eds that one was not particularly controversial. There were other op-eds that were, a little more exciting. So Carl Bergstrom, professor of biology at University of Washington, was invited to write something for the New York Times, and so he invited me to help him sort of frame the piece. And we talked a lot about herd immunity and sort of what it really meant in the context of a setting where there was not an effective vaccine. And frankly, we didn't really have very many effective treatments at that time. We've obviously come a long way since then, but thinking back to April, this is May 1, 2020, it was a very different time. Also, the quality of care was so poor because everyone was kind of underwater in terms of all the hospitals. So this was another sort of, another time where I was like, whoa, this is some big time stuff. And this ended up in the Sunday Times. So this got me a certain amount of recognition. I was on many lists, like Twitter lists, so 50 experts to trust in a pandemic. And I think a big thing I learned is effective communication can go a really long way. Like, if you start being known for someone who can explain things clearly, knows what you're talking about, can digest it and report it back to folks in a way that they can understand, that it can go a really long way. And so what I want to talk about first is sort of what I actually did. So that was some anecdotes, but now I'm going to talk about really kind of the core of it. So what was I doing? What was I asked to do? And my role as a statistician or analyst, mathematician, whoever, but my role as a numbers person. So the first biggest role, and I've touched upon this briefly, was to explain and to teach. So, the public was becoming exposed to a lot of different terminology that we use in infectious disease research, and someone needed to explain what it was, right? What is the basic reproduction number? What is the sensitivity and specificity of a diagnostic test? These are things I've been teaching in my statistics classes, my biostatistics classes for a long time, and it's just sort of, but now explaining them to the public or explaining them to reporters. What are the implications of a false negative? For some of the infectious disease dynamics, what is the herd immunity threshold? And one of the biggest areas for me was about vaccines. So I trained with experts who have literally written books about design analysis of vaccine studies. And so there were a lot of questions about how do we define the efficacy of a vaccine? What does that number that you see reported out mean for an individual? And how do we actually design that trial to measure the efficacy of the vaccine? What are the components that go into that? And so of the things that I talked to a lot of reporters, but actually one of the cool ones, I talked to Consumer Reports, for example, and they wrote sort of an explainer about vaccine trials for COVID vaccines and like what is the actual process. And so there was like teaching, okay, well, you have this, they start out with these small phase 1 trials, and you've got these larger trials that you're looking at immunogenicity and safety, and then you have your big trials where you're really looking to see, does it protect individuals from the outcome that you really want to prevent? It's powered, you have to explain what power is, you have to explain like how big the study needs to be, what we will know, what we won't know at the end, how long will it take? And how long the trial takes will depend a little bit on what's happening in the community with how much COVID there was. And it was able to go very quickly because there was so much transmission. And that is another way that the process could accelerate compared to a traditional vaccine trial, which often will take several years. Just the magnitude of community transmission was another way that this was accelerated. So really just like explaining and teaching. Another thing that I was asked to do was to provide critical appraisal and really to function like a peer reviewer and almost to do rapid peer review. And this is the preprint era. And so what I would receive from reporters would be what I like to call pre-preprints. And so you get, they submit the preprint to medRxiv, and before that preprint is posted on medRxiv, they send it to a reporter. It takes like 24 hours, right, to post. And they send it to the reporter, and they want the reporter to write the story. And basically, I get asked by a reporter, or I would get asked by a reporter, to evaluate the evidence. So you're functioning like a peer reviewer, and you're asked to explain sort of what are the strengths and limitations of a study, what did they even do, and also like what do you think of it, what do you make of it, how does it update what you think about what's going on. Sometimes I wasn't so lucky to get preprints. Sometimes I would literally get slides, or like random excerpts, and then I was like, this is too far, this is too crazy. Sometimes they wouldn't even be in English. And it's, so it was kind of the wild, wild west. But the good quality ones would send you something that was self-contained enough that you could really evaluate the quality. And the types of studies I would receive would be like prevalence surveys. So thinking back to my own training with survey design, thinking about sort of how representative a study was, how representative a population was, how uncertainty was factored in with respect to the test. There were a lot of modeling studies. I don't really consider myself a modeler, but I know enough, I've worked enough with models to be able to critically evaluate them. And what are the assumptions that are baked in? And what are the limitations? And what does it really mean for, what policy decisions or things like that? And then towards later on, a lot of vaccine trials and vaccine studies, observational vaccine studies. So really just, like I was also doing a lot of peer reviewing, right? Like regular peer reviewing. But this is almost, it's the same thing, just on a much tighter scale. And then, so I would have, a day or a few hours to review, and then I would talk on the phone with a reporter. And I'm just flagging, I talked to a lot of reporters and had a lot of great relationships, but, the really great ones are really great. And I just want to flag Carl Zimmer from the New York Times and Matt Herper from Stat News, that, the good ones you learn a lot from, and they ask the right questions, and, there's a wide range of quality, there's people who really live and breathe some of this biomedical research, and they're really a joy to work with. So another activity that I did, I like to think that I tried to teach others how to critically appraise, okay? So it's like not just teaching the fundamentals, but really teaching people how to think about what they were looking at. And so I had some threads, Twitter threads, that had a certain amount of reach, but think like an epidemiologist or think like a biostatistician. Okay, I see this in the surveillance data, and so I think this way about it. I factor in that I know there's these lags. I know that it's missing this population. I compare it with this other study that I also saw that has this different set of limitations. How do I factor these things together? So really, understanding the strengths and limitations, but also how we triangulate these new results with existing results, and teaching people how I thought through that process instead of just skipping to the end, trying to teach people how I thought about it. And I'm just going to toot my own horn a little bit. That Ed Young offered a nice quote to University of Florida about me, and said, while many pandemic experts will reliably tell you what is happening, Dean belongs to a special group who will also reliably tell you how to think about what is happening. As a reporter, I appreciate both her insight and humility. I should put this on my CV. I am proud of this one. He's an incredibly smart person. And I did put effort into that. That is something that consciously I wanted to do, is educate people about this sort of scientific process, this thought process. Okay, and one of the last things I did as a statistician was advocate for better quality data. I had a platform, and so I was able to advocate. So I had some writing. So this is an op-ed in Boston Review, Steps to a Better COVID Response, and talked, just generally through a few things. But the example I really want to flag is from Bramar Mukherjee, who's the chair of the Biostatistics Department at the University of Michigan. And she was very active in COVID modeling, but in particular with India. And I love this. She made a data wish list, right? She said, this is what I want to see. This is the level of disaggregation that I want on the data. And sort of making explicit sort of requests and saying, this is what we need to be able to do our modeling. This is what we need to be able to do our analysis. I think we saw a lot of where there were issues with the modernization of our data and the flows of our data, and how laggy our public health surveillance systems are. And I think from the outside, people probably think, well, you have this data, it must just go boop, 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 and right through and become available. But in reality, there's like a lot of fax machines involved, and there's a lot of room for improvement. And so advocating for better quality data, I think, is another thing that we were able to do. I also, just as a small thing, like to advocate for figures. I don't know, I kind of consider myself like a figure influencer. Like I was like, if I saw a figure I really liked, I would flag that. And so here's an example of a time series heat map. I take no credit for any like making this at all, but I would just see it and be like, wow, this is cool. This is a cool graphical representation that you can see how cases evolved over time, and also how they changed across age groups. And it was funny, I was talking to Kathy Ensor, who gave the ASA invited address, and she independently brought up, well, when I was working with the mayor of Houston, we realized how much that he liked. They did some A/B testing of different figures, and they're like, the favorite thing was the time series heat map. And I was like, okay, so also just advocating for better figures as well. Okay, so a few highs and lows. So my favorite experiences, I think, were where I was able to use my teaching, where I was able to teach in a way that helped people understand a complex topic. And so, for example, there were some data that came out of an AstraZeneca trial, one of the vaccine trials, and there had this kind of unusual result, which was how well did the vaccine prevent asymptomatic infection, which actually I don't think that they really should have reported. I think it's the estimand itself is not really a sensible estimand. But I sort of went through and explained why I thought that, with, as you can see, some not very fancy figures. Right? I didn't spend a lot of time on this, and also my blue marker ran out. But this got a lot of traction. People, through a series of tweets, I'm not going to go through the math itself, but through a series of tweets was able to explain a phenomenon where if a vaccine prevents disease but doesn't prevent infection, if you're just comparing the size of the blue bucket, that actually this could get bigger. But it doesn't mean that the vaccine is performing poorly. It just means that the effect has been to downgrade the severity of disease, and so you have more of these asymptomatic infections. And so trying to explain that, and then someone suggested that, I should do it in Duplos. And then I made it in Duplos, and people really liked that. And I was like, this is cool. It's cool to, explain, to teach something, and to have it reach sort of more than the typical audience that I would be able to reach by teaching my survival analysis class or whatever class what I teach at Emory. But then where I really was able to get a big reach is that The Economist reprinted it. And actually, I like my version better because they aligned them at the bottom, which I disagree, but I think it should have been top aligned the way that I had it. But now this is my cocktail party fact that I have a figure in The Economist. And something similar happened with Omicron. So when Omicron emerged, there was also a question about the severity. But now you have this strain that has this increased capacity for reinfection. And so one thing I was interested in explaining, well, what if this new variant is not any less severe, but it just has a bigger denominator because of the increased capacity for reinfection? This was early. I think since then we've realized it is less severe, but also this probably did factor in that this increased capacity for reinfection increased the denominator. And so I was able to explain that with a figure, and I was really proud of this as well. This is not something I spent a ton of time on, but it sort of spoke to my interest in teaching through figures and teaching through diagrams and explaining, I think, what are very complex topics, but to people who did find it enlightening and helpful. And this also was reprinted in The Economist. So that was definitely a high for me. Lows were distressing kind of, when you put yourself in the public eye, that things come back. You don't want them to come back. Distressing tweets, emails. I even received some physical mail that was upsetting. And only to my office. It didn't come to my home, which I know some people had that experience. But there were big time implications of all this stuff, and people had strong feelings, and it did involve putting myself out there to a degree that things did come back. There was also just anxiety about saying the wrong thing or being in the wrong place, especially as someone who's relatively junior. Should I be the one talking about these things? And sometimes feeling a little insecure and uncertain. But sometimes I was in the right place. And actually, I'm going to say one experience. I was writing an op-ed for the New York Times about vaccines, about the process of a vaccine trial. And I had used the word, a field trial, which refers to a trial in the field. Okay, as opposed to where you're really looking at the outcome is infection and disease and the things that are happening in our communities, as opposed to you're just looking at immunological outcomes or things that you can kind of measure in the lab. And the New York Times says, we can't find this word field trial. The fact checkers, it goes through a very intense fact checking process. They said we couldn't find anyone using this phrase, are you sure? And I was like, no, it's right, it's good. And eventually they did find something. I said, okay, we found something in the WHO, that uses the word field trial. They sent me something I had written. So I was like, okay, I'm in the right place. Okay, so now some lessons learned. So first, I know this sounds so obvious, right? But speak plainly, avoid jargon, And it's challenging, but you have to find a way to be able to explain something that doesn't rely on a lot of words that people don't know. You know, we're so used to relying on our phrases and our sort of academies, I don't know if that's a word, but the way that we speak in a very particular way. And that's definitely the easier way. It's the easier way for me to communicate, is to be able to rely on things that people have a shared knowledge of. But you lose people along the way. And so we need to avoid jargon and also be concise. People have very limited attention spans. It's just a reality. I think we all do. We're all competing for attention. And you have to be concise and get to the point quickly. I love this quote. So I read this in the book How to Write a Lot by Paul Sylvia. Some readers might think you're smart if your writing is impenetrable, but you don't want that undiscerning audience. Most scientists are impressed by good ideas and interesting findings, so don't hide your ideas behind a wall of junk English. Okay? I love that. You don't want that undiscerning audience. You don't want to hide behind a bunch of like sounding smart, right? Like you want your ideas to speak for themselves. All that to say, this is actually extremely hard and it takes a lot of practice. And it reminds me of like, it's one thing to think you know something, it's another to be able to teach it. It's another to be able to explain something in a way that is simple and direct and doesn't rely on jargon. So what I would like to do when I would tweet or write is imagine I was talking to a colleague who is not in my field. So someone who's extremely smart, you know, totally capable, but just doesn't have that same shared, vocabulary that I have, so I can't rely on that. I have to find a different way to explain it. That being said, right, it takes a lot of practice. Okay, another thing, control the nitpicking. Okay, so when you're looking at a study, when you're looking at data, don't miss the forest for the trees. You have to remember the big picture. And this is challenging. This is a quote from a piece in Medium from Kevin McConway and Sir David Spiegelhalter, Top Tips for Statisticians Communicating with the Media. And statisticians are trained to be ultra-critical, expecting to point out the weaknesses in any discussion of evidence and to emphasize uncertainty. But this can easily come across wrongly because the interviewer or journalist or audience haven't learned to distinguish between lack of evidence for X and evidence that X is false. If you spend your whole time just nitpicking and talking about all the things you see that are wrong, that's what the audience is going to hear. Like, they're only going to hear the wrong things. They're not going to hear any of the value or the things that are right. This, again, is really hard. It's not how we were trained. I mean, I think about the way that we're trained to do peer reviews or grant reviews. We focus very much on the limitations. But if you give a lot of real estate to all the things that you think are wrong, that's what's going to come across instead of the real value of what the study communicates or what the data is actually telling you. So there's also challenge in writing. You know, sometimes people want to have the most accurate, perfect, like no one can criticize the way that I've written this perfect, you know, with all the right phrasing. And I mean, as a statistician, I was often asked to like talk about confidence intervals or p-values, and there's things that are really hard to communicate briefly and accurately. You have to kind of sometimes, there's a tension between the length. If you write something that's too long, you risk losing people. And you have to sometimes distill things down to the most important part for the audience. You have to remember your audience. Your audience may not be your colleagues. Your audience may be people who really don't know a lot about this issue. So I think the nitpicking, both in how we evaluate other studies and also how we do our own writing and the level of detail, is something that we need to be mindful of. Okay, and the last point is to explain why it matters. And so be prepared to answer the question, so what does it mean? So when I would be asked to critically appraise things, definitely the easiest thing for me is to just say, oh, this is what the study methods are. This is exactly what was done. These are the strengths and limitations. But that's not really what the reporter cares about. You have to skip ahead, and the harder part is to be able to look at a study and say, what are the main findings? What does it mean? And how does it synthesize with other evidence that's available? So really, how do we triangulate it? How does it update our understanding? Does it reinforce something that we've already learned? Does it conflict with something that we've already seen? And that is much harder. But really, that's what they're going to immediately ask. And so being prepared. And I also think that, so again, this is really hard. And for me, at least, this is not the way that I was trained to think about the problem. I think, there's so much emphasis on the methods and the limitations that it's harder to make it all the way to the other end of the spectrum. But ultimately, it makes for better communications if you can really sit back and figure out what does it mean, and also for better science. It's made me appreciate the discussion section of a paper. Sometimes I'm so focused on the methods and the results that the discussion section kind of just comes last, right? But that's like really where you're saying, like, why does it matter? Why do we care? How does it fit with everything else? And it's given me a bigger appreciation for that. Okay, so moving forward, so what do I hope to see more from our community is more folks kind of teaching and sharing and connecting with an audience who wants to learn. There are a lot of different avenues for teaching others that are not just traditional publications. And I recommend finding something that you care about and that excites you, because people are very attuned to authenticity. And so if you can demonstrate genuine enthusiasm and interest in a topic, I think that's contagious. And people really respect that and think that's cool. In the process, it's an opportunity to expand your professional presence and your reputation, and also to attract a new generation to the field. I think it can increase sort of how welcoming the field is. If you can make things more accessible, you can show you're excited about what you're doing, and I think that's a great thing. So some examples. So Andrew Gelman has had a very successful stat modeling blog for a very long time. I want to call out one of my really good friends, Caitlin Rivers, who writes a Substack called Force of Infection, where she talks about sort of current trends in infectious diseases. But it doesn't all have to be so serious. I mean, here's from Chelsea Parlett-Pelleriti. And so this is where I'd put my properly defined central moments if I had any, just labeled Koshi. So there's a range of people who are just doing fun things as well. Okay, another recommendation is for our community to be more proactive about building a research communication plan. And so in addition to how we plan to do our research, and we have our peer-reviewed publications as the main thing, taking a little extra time to think about how else we are planning to disseminate those findings. So what else are you going to do to teach and share what you have learned? And recently, I've seen this more in grant applications that I've been reviewing. You'll see, I'm going to make this online course. I'm going to share it at this workshop. I am going to write this op-ed. I'm going to make this video. And I think that's really cool because people learn in different ways. And they don't always just learn through the highly technical publication. I think particularly if you're trying to get people to use a new method that you've developed and you want uptake of this or this package or something, that finding different ways to teach and explain that. And I think this builds upon existing efforts to increase the accessibility of our work. And not just, we've seen a lot of progress in people creating packages or posting code and accessibility of that, but also just accessibility of the ideas. And so having a research communication plan. And actually just a few days ago, there was a piece in Nature, how sharing your science in an opinion piece can boost your career. General readers are interested in your opinions too. And it talks about a group that had their, they spent all this time writing a peer-reviewed publication, and then they spent a little bit of time writing an editorial, right? And so they accompanied, along with their main body of work, a more accessible version. And so just factoring that in. So at Emory University at the Rollins School of Public Health, where I am faculty, I've recently been involved in a strategic planning initiative, which included communications as one of the pillars. I was part of that working group. And so through that, one of the aims is to champion public health, to promote and strengthen trust in public health information. And it's to increase sort of thought leadership, to train our faculty, staff, and students on how to effectively communicate, and media training, op-ed training, and things like that. So really putting some effort to teach people the logistics, like what does this process look like? Who talks to whom? What are the timescales? What is the level of editing? It's really an unreal level of editing that goes on, and these really rapid turnarounds, and so to have support from the university for that. I think, that maybe that's something that's happening at Emory. Not all institutions may have that type of goal or those resources. I think there's also a role for our societies to step in as well and provide support. So this is a quote from Shihong Lin from Harvard, a quote in Amstat News. So one of the challenges, reflecting back on the pandemic, one of the challenges was how to effectively communicate our findings to the general public and policymakers. I hope that the ASA can provide media training for statisticians in the future, as public communication skills are very important. So there's also a role there for our societies. And then finally, just coming to the table. I don't know, I think there's this viewing ourselves viewing our communities as more than just analysts or data people or just that sort of technical expertise that kind of comes in at a certain stage, steps in, leaves, isn't really involved with the whole process from soup to nuts. And viewing ourselves as people who are part of science. And my old postdoc mentor used to talk about science with a capital S, like these big, thorny, high impact problems, which are going to necessarily be interdisciplinary. And so I think about mitigation for climate change and air pollution or data modernization, or things where your perspective as a data person, as a technical person is extremely valuable. So I think also just coming to the table for these larger efforts and these larger discussions, and really recognizing the value and importance of your perspective. Okay, so just to wrap up. So I talked about sort of the role of a statistician, which was to teach and explain, to critically appraise results, and also to teach others how to critically appraise. And there's also an opportunity to advocate for data. We learned the importance of being clear and concise, controlling your nitpicking, and focusing on why it matters. What did you learn? What does it mean? Don't neglect that part. And moving forward, hoping to see folks share their enthusiasm more for their own work for science through different venues, proactively building a research communication plan, and coming to the table for these big, messy discussions. Okay, so I'll wrap up there. So thank you so much for your time and attention, and thanks again to the Joint Policy Board for Mathematics and the American Statistical Association, and to whoever was kind enough to nominate me for this award. I still don't actually know, but I'm so grateful, and to you for listening. So thanks, everyone.
Hi, pardon my voice. I'm wondering, how much did you experience any of the larger issues of distrust of experts as you're trying to kind of communicate things? And related to that question, is Twitter still a place for exchange, or is it no longer?
Yeah, I definitely got some of the distrust, particularly about vaccines, and sometimes I'll still get a little bit of it. I had a weird experience one time where someone called me up on the phone claiming to be an independent reporter and asking me if I was being paid off to like say certain things, and I don't know. Yeah, so there's a lot out there. I think what I tried to do was to just be as honest as I could about things, and also sort of the strengths and limitations of things, not be overly confident in certain areas and just sort of play it straight. But there are much larger systemic issues. I didn't really engage with and folks that I thought were not approaching me authentically, and I do give a lot of credit to those who do that. But I think that requires its own sort of fortitude and training, and so yeah. But it's a larger issue, and I'm really glad that there is effort in like social science research to study kind of how trust and the best way that we communicate to build trust, because I think this is a big, thorny, multidisciplinary issue that will require a lot of input. And with Twitter, I don't know. It's too bad, because there's it's been such a great way to connect with a lot of colleagues. I personally have stepped back quite a bit, but I don't know what the future will hold. But but I'm grateful to at least have the connection with my colleagues that are still on there. So yeah.
So you were talking about advocacy at a national level, but what about family and friends who are anti-vaxxers? How do you communicate with people that are close to you?
There are some great resources that have been put out about sort of how to talk through things, and it's challenging. I have people in my life that I feel that I was able to make an impact on, and then I'm sure there are people who just sort of have hardened in their opinions. But I feel that I was able to sort of speak up front with certain people, particularly close to me, and make sure that they are getting protected, and sort of just talk through the evidence and just like in a sober way. But it is challenging, and I don't feel that I haven't like waded into that a ton, because it's just such a I find myself always worried I'm going to say the wrong thing sometimes, and I think looking for sort of evidence-based ways that people communicate. Sorry, not the best answer, but.
Are there additional questions for our speaker? Okay, if you have more questions, Natalie will be down the hall in room 204, and happy to talk to people individually, but let's thank her one more time for a great talk.